The last person to see Selena Evans alive was Marcus Geller, and the moment replays in his mind with crystalline clarity. October 16th, 1988, 5:42 p.m. The 31-year-old German alpinist pointed his Nikon at the young American woman and captured what would become the most haunting image of his life. Selena in profile, navy Kelty backpack on her shoulders, smiling as the setting Himalayan sun bathed her face in golden light. She was 24 years old, at 11,286 feet in the Everest region, looking exactly like someone who'd finally arrived where she'd always dreamed of being. Marcus lowered the camera, gave her a thumbs up, turned to descend first. The wind picked up, a cold gust that made him zip his jacket. He counted 32 steps down the rocky path. Then he glanced back. The trail was empty. His brain rejected what his eyes reported. It had to be the light playing tricks. Sunset. Shadows pooling and shifting in mountain terrain. Marcus blinked hard. Maybe she'd stepped behind an outcropping or crouched to adjust her boots. The trail curved slightly, yes, but not enough to hide a 5'4" woman wearing a bright red jacket. He stood frozen for 15 seconds. That paralysis when reality refuses to match expectation. Then his stomach contracted with real fear. "Selena!" His voice cracked against thin air. The echo returned hollow, bouncing off granite faces. He called again, louder, throat burning. Nothing. Just wind whistling through the pass and distant. Prayer flags snapping. Marcus ran back up, heart hammering with dread unrelated to altitude. His boots slipped on loose scree. He grabbed rock to steady himself, felt coldness seep through his glove. Small Buddhist prayer stones sat stacked along the path, offerings to appease mountain spirits. Marcus had photographed them earlier, amused by superstition. Now they seemed accusatory. When he reached where he'd taken the final photo, Selena wasn't there. No signs of disturbance, no scuff marks, no torn fabric, no blood, nothing. The trail continued 20 meters to a viewpoint locals called Buddha's Finger. Marcus scrambled there, leaned over the edge expecting to see her body on rocks below. The drop was steep but not sheer, maybe 40 feet to a ledge. If she'd fallen, she'd be visible. She wasn't. Panic builds in waves. Marcus stood there 2 full minutes, mind cycling through. Impossible explanations. Had she passed him somehow, taken a different route? Was there a side path he'd missed? He knew these thoughts were irrational. The trail was linear, 3 feet wide. You couldn't pass someone without contact. But the alternative, that Selena had ceased to exist between his 32 steps, was so fundamentally impossible his brain kept offering absurd theories. When Marcus descended to the meeting point, his face had gone snow-colored. His hands trembled, gripping Mingma Dorje Sherpa's shoulder. "She's gone. I can't find her." Selena Marie Evans wasn't the type who underestimated mountains. Born March 12, 1964 in Boulder, Colorado, she grew up hiking the Rockies with her father Thomas, a retired geologist who taught her to read topographical maps before long division. By 8, Selena could identify sedimentary layers and predict weather by cloud formations. By 17, she completed trails intimidating men twice her size, not through recklessness but meticulous preparation. Her father drilled into her the sacred indifference of nature. Mountains don't hate or love you, don't even notice you. They simply exist, and humans are brief visitors. At 21, she graduated with a physical education degree from University of Colorado, took a job as climbing instructor at Summit Dreams Gym in Denver. Pay was modest, $8.50 hourly, but allowed saving for travel. Selena kept a red notebook labeled, "Mountains I Must Know Before I Die, Everest." Occupied the first line since 1982. For 3 years she deposited every extra dollar into savings, generic groceries, second-hand jackets, no restaurants or bars. By September 1988, 3,147. Enough. Her mother Ruth agonized over the solo travel decision. 3 days before departure, Ruth alternated between crying and frantic questioning. "What if something happens? What if you get sick?" Ruth gripped Selena's hands across the kitchen table, searching for doubt. But Selena possessed her father's stubbornness. "Mom, I'm not going to get lost. I'm going to find myself. Ruth would replay that, sentenced 10,000 times over 3 years, in therapy, in sleepless nights, in hospitals, to find myself, both mantra and curse. The October 16th trekking group had 8 people, 4 tourists, 2 porters, 1 guide. Besides Selina and Marcus, there was Colette Moreau, a 29-year-old French photographer, and George and Pamela Hutchison, retired Brits celebrating their 35th anniversary with one last proper adventure. The porters were brothers, Tashi and Norbu, 19 and 22, strong and quiet. Then Mingma Dorje Sherpa. Mingma was 38, with 15 Everest seasons etched in lines around his eyes. Respected in Namche Bazaar, known for caution, for bringing clients home safely, for refusing routes when weather turned, he knew every curve, every unstable rock, every atmospheric pressure sign. But at 5:15 p.m. that afternoon, Mingma made a decision haunting him until death 14 years. Later, he granted Selina's request to explore a secondary trail. Official itinerary ended at Kumjung Viewpoint, return by 6:30 p.m. But Selina had read about an alternate route in a Kathmandu guidebook, less traveled path to Buddha's finger. Could they please, just quickly, explore it? 20 minutes. She wanted to photograph before sunset. Mingma hesitated. Sky clear, no storms. 5:18 p.m., plenty of daylight. George and Pamela exhausted, already napping. Colette nursing a blister. Only Selina radiated inexhaustible energy. 20 minutes, Mingma agreed, words feeling heavy. Just to Buddha's finger. Photos then back. Don't go further. Trails not maintained, very narrow, understand? Selina nodded enthusiastically, already adjusting her pack, moving toward the trail with Marcus following to document. Mingma stayed at main viewpoint with others, directing brothers to organize. Equipment. He sat on a boulder, pulled out butter tea, watched the sun sink. At 5:42 p.m., Marcus took the last photograph. At 5:58 p.m., he returned alone, trembling, eyes having witnessed the impossible absence of someone with no reason to disappear. Initial search began 6:34 p.m. when Marcus stumbled. Back without Selina, face drained, breathing ragged from primal fear. Mingma's reaction was immediate. Crisis mode precision. He mobilized Porter brothers and 4 Sherpas from other groups. Within 18 minutes, 7 men climbed toward the secondary trail with rope, headlamps, first aid, grim determination. They searched systematically, calling until hoarse, examining every meter, checking fall zones and crevices. Marcus accompanied them, retracing his path, pointing to the photo spot. She was right here, he kept repeating, voice breaking. Right fucking here. By 9:10 p.m., temperature dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit, wind howling strong enough to knock men sideways. Ice formed on eyebrows, headlamps cut through solid darkness. Sherpas continued with dedication bordering frantic, professional obligation and cultural imperative. Losing someone on your watch isn't just bad business, it's spiritual. Failure. Mingma moved with methodical precision, checking areas others might miss. Found nothing. Not fabric. Not boot prints. Not one goddamn thing. They suspended search at 11:17 p.m. when visibility became too dangerous. Searchers descended in silence, locked in private horror. Marcus walked, mechanically in shock. At base camp, Colette's face went ashen, counting returning figures. George sat heavily, face in hands. Pamela cried, quiet British crying trained by emotional propriety. Mingma radioed Namche Bazaar authorities. Voice steady, hands shaking so much he gripped the transmitter with both palms. What happened in those 32 steps? How does someone vanish on a safe trail in clear weather? The answer lay buried under ice and stone, waiting 3 years to surface, along with evidence that would devastate a family and expose failures that could have saved a life. Ruth Evans received the phone call at 3:47 a.m. Mountain Time on October 17, 1988. She'd been awake anyway. Mothers of traveling daughters sleep lightly, ears tuned to phantom rings. When the phone actually rang, she knew before picking up that something was catastrophically wrong. No one calls at 3:47 a.m. with Good news. The voice on the other end belonged to a State Department official named Richard Chen, and he spoke with the careful, trained gentleness of someone delivering information designed to shatter worlds. Mrs. Evans, I'm calling regarding your daughter Selina. There's been an incident in Nepal. She's missing from a trekking expedition. Search efforts are underway. Missing. Such an insufficient word for the void that opened beneath Ruth's feet. Not injured, not sick. Missing. As if Selina were a set of car keys that would turn up eventually. Ruth's first coherent thought was absurd. In its specificity, Selina had promised to call from Kathmandu before heading to base camp, and Ruth had waited by the phone for 3 hours on the scheduled day, and when the call didn't come, she'd told herself the connection was probably bad. The timing got confused. It was fine. Everything was fine. Now that missed call felt like prophecy she'd failed to read. Thomas Evans woke to find his wife sitting motionless on the edge of their bed, still holding the phone receiver, though the line had gone dead. "Tom?" she said, and her voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. "Our babies?" Gone. Thomas was a geologist, a man of empirical data and measurable evidence. His first instinct was to problem solve, call the embassy, contact the trekking company, get more information, establish facts. But as he sat beside Ruth in their darkened bedroom, listening to her breathing go ragged, he felt something he'd never experienced in 30 years of marriage to this woman, the sensation that they were falling together into an abyss with no bottom. The first 72 hours were bureaucratic hell, wrapped in agonizing helplessness. The U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu provided updates that contradicted each other. Search radius kept changing. Number of personnel varied by report, weather conditions described differently by different officials. The trekking company, Himalayan Trails and Adventures, issued a formal statement expressing deepest concern, while simultaneously noting that Selina had voluntarily chosen to explore an off-itinerary trail. Ruth fixated on that word voluntarily, with building rage, as if choosing to photograph a viewpoint 20 meters from the main trail was reckless adventurism deserving of consequence. By day 4, Ruth made a decision that shocked. Their small boulder community, she was flying to Nepal. Thomas tried to dissuade her. What could she accomplish that professional searchers couldn't? Ruth looked at her husband with eyes that had gone flat and terrifying. "I will not sit in this house drinking tea while strangers look for my daughter. I will not." Thomas recognized that tone. It was the same voice she'd used 24 years earlier, when doctors said she'd likely never carry a pregnancy to term, and Ruth had responded by having a healthy baby 9 months later through sheer force of will. You didn't argue with Ruth Evans when she used that voice. She arrived in Kathmandu on October 24th, 8 days after Selina's disappearance. The city assaulted her senses. Crushing heat, exhaust fumes, vendors shouting in Nepali, the strange saffron smell of incense mixing with open sewage. Ruth spoke no Nepali, had never left the United States before, was a 51-year-old elementary school librarian, navigating a foreign country alone while her world disintegrated. She carried one large photograph of Selina, the same image Marcus had taken at 5:42 p.m., though Ruth didn't know that detail yet, and showed it to everyone. Taxi. Drivers. Hotel clerks. Police officers. "My daughter. Has anyone seen my daughter?" The Namche Bazaar police station was a concrete building with peeling yellow paint and 3 flickering fluorescent lights. The officer who met Ruth spoke English with heavy accent and profound discomfort. He explained that search efforts had been comprehensive, but that mountain conditions and limited accessibility had prevented complete coverage. Ruth heard what he wasn't saying. They'd given up. She requested to see the search area herself. The officer shook his head gravely. Too dangerous for civilians. Too high for someone not acclimatized. She'd need permits, guides, equipment. Ruth left that station and hired a private Sherpa guide within 3 hours. His name was Pasang. He'd worked Everest for 20 years, and he agreed to take her to Buddha's Finger for $200 American. The trek took. 2 days. Ruth suffered splitting altitude headaches, nausea, breathlessness that felt like drowning on dry land. She didn't care. Every step was for Selina. When they reached the secondary trail, Ruth stood where her daughter had last been seen and experienced a dissociation so profound she briefly forgot her own name. This narrow path, these indifferent rocks. This was the last place Selina existed. Ruth called her daughter's name until her voice gave out, knowing it was irrational, knowing Selina couldn't possibly hear, unable to stop herself. Pasang watched with professional sympathy. Saying nothing, she returned to Boulder on November 12th, 3 pounds lighter, 10 years older, carrying no answers. Thomas met her at Denver airport and barely recognized his wife. But Ruth hadn't given up. She'd just changed tactics. If official channels were useless, she'd create her own. She began writing letters, one per month every 16th, to the Nepalese Ministry of Home Affairs, to International Mountain Rescue, to the US State Department, to climbing organizations, to anyone with influence or authority. The letters were meticulous, factual, and increasingly desperate. My daughter. Selina Evans remains missing since October 16, 1988, from a trekking trail in the Everest region. I am writing to request renewed search efforts and investigation into possible areas not yet covered. The letters were never answered. Not once. Not by anyone. Ruth kept copies in a 3-ring binder. That grew thicker monthly, physical evidence of institutional indifference. Thomas Evans died on April 3, 1989, of a massive heart attack while mowing their lawn. He was 56 years old with no previous cardiac issues. The emergency room doctor spoke quietly with Ruth after Thomas was pronounced dead. "Mrs. Evans, I need to ask, has your family been under any unusual stress recently?" Ruth almost laughed. Unusual stress. Her husband had spent 5 months sleeping 4 hours nightly, sitting at the kitchen table past midnight studying Nepal maps with a magnifying glass, marking potential search zones in red pen, writing his own letters that were also never answered. Yes, doctor, you could say they'd been under unusual stress. Now Ruth carried 2 losses. Friends worried she'd collapse entirely. Instead, she became harder, more focused. She quit her library job to dedicate full time to what she called bringing Selina home. She spent 8 to 10 hours daily at the public library, researching Himalayan geography, mountain rescue protocols, similar missing persons cases. She taught herself rudimentary Nepali using language tapes from the University of Colorado Library. She contacted families of other tourists who'd disappeared in Nepal, forming a grim network of the abandoned. One family in particular became Ruth's closest ally, the Holstroms, whose son Derek had vanished on Annapurna in 1986. His body was never found, his case never solved. Janet Holstrom and Ruth Evans spoke, weekly by phone, sharing information, supporting each other through the waves of grief that never stopped coming. "We're the ghost mothers," Janet said once, and Ruth understood perfectly. They existed in liminal space between hope and acceptance, unable to grieve properly because there were no bodies, no confirmed deaths, no closure. The world moved on. 1989 became 1990. Media attention evaporated. Friends stopped asking about Selina, not from cruelty, but from not knowing what to say. Ruth's house filled with boxes, police reports, newspaper clippings, correspondence with officials, topographical maps marked with theories. Her sister Ellen visited from California and was horrified by what she saw. Ruth had converted Selina's childhood bedroom into a command center, walls covered with photos and maps connected by red string like a detective movie. "Ruth, honey, this isn't healthy," Ellen ventured. Ruth's response was cold. Healthy is for people who haven't lost everything. But Ruth wasn't entirely alone in her obsession. Though she didn't know it yet, there was someone in Namche Bazaar who also couldn't let Selina's case die, a young police officer named Dawa Sherpa, who sat at his desk on slow nights, reviewing a file that officially didn't exist anymore, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Why do some disappearances haunt us while others fade? What transforms a mother's grief into an unstoppable force? Ruth Evans was about to discover that her relentless letters had reached one person who still cared, and that 3 years of silence were about to shatter with a discovery that would change everything. October 16th, 1991. 3 years to the day since Selena Evans vanished. Ruth woke at 5:47 a.m. without an alarm. Her body had internalized this date like cellular memory. She'd developed a ritual for the anniversary: visit Selena's grave at Green Mountain Cemetery. Except there was no grave, just a memorial stone Thomas had insisted on installing before he died, a piece of Colorado granite with Selena Marie Evans, 1964-1988, beloved daughter. Forever in the mountains. Ruth hated that stone, hated the presumption of death without proof, the finality it suggested, but she visited anyway because it was the only physical place that acknowledged her daughter existed. The international package arrived at 2:13 p.m. Ruth was sitting at her kitchen table working through another stack of unanswered correspondence when she heard the mail truck. She'd stopped expecting anything meaningful years ago. Mail meant bills, promotional flyers, occasionally sympathetic notes from Janet Holstrom. But today, the mail carrier rang the doorbell, holding a battered cardboard box covered in Nepali postal stamps and customs declarations. "Needs signature," he said cheerfully, oblivious to how Ruth's hands began trembling. The return address was Government of Nepal, Ministry of Home Affairs, Kathmandu. Ruth signed with fingers that had gone numb. She waited until the mail carrier drove away before opening it, some superstitious part of her believing that whatever was inside required privacy. She used kitchen scissors to cut the packing tape, and the smell hit her first. Musty fabric, old paper, something indefinably foreign. Inside were Selena's belongings from the Namche Bazaar campsite, items Ruth had requested returned dozens of times over 3 years, a journal, 3 unsent postcards, a folded T-shirt, red, with University of Colorado logo, a broken flashlight with corroded batteries, a small Ziploc bag containing Selena's passport and $47 in Nepalese rupees, and a single-page letter, typed on official stationery: "Dear Mrs. Evans, the Government of Nepal hereby returns personal effects recovered from Ms. Selena Marie Evans' campsite in October 1988. Investigation into Ms. Evans' disappearance has been officially closed. As of October 16, 1991, due to absence of evidence and exhaustion of all reasonable search possibilities. Our deepest condolences to your family. No further inquiries will be processed. Respectfully, signature illegible, Administrative Officer, Ministry of Home Affairs." Ruth read that letter 3 times. Each time different phrases stabbed her. Officially closed. Exhaustion of all reasonable search possibilities. No further inquiries will be processed. They were giving up. No, they'd already given up, and were only now bothering to tell her. 3 years of letters, 3 years of begging, 3 years of maintaining hope against hope, and this was the response. A box of useless objects and a bureaucratic "fuck you." She opened the journal with shaking hands. Selena's handwriting. God, her daughter's handwriting. So familiar, it made Ruth's chest constrict. The entries were mundane, descriptions of Kathmandu's chaos, excitement about the upcoming trek, observations about other travelers. The last entry was dated October 15th, 1988, the night before she disappeared. "Tomorrow we head to the higher trails. I can't sleep. Too excited. This is everything I've worked for. Dad would be so proud. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Can't wait to call Mom when I'm back and tell her about Buddha's finger." Buddha's finger, the place her daughter died. Ruth closed the journal, and something inside her shattered completely. She'd held together through the initial disappearance, through Thomas's death, through 3 years of institutional abandonment. But this box of remnants, this official termination of hope, was the breaking point. Her sister Ellen found her 6 hours later, unconscious on the kitchen floor, the empty bottle of Thomas's old sleeping pills on the counter. Ruth had swallowed 37 pills. The suicide note was 1 sentence: "I can't live in a world that forgot her." Ellen called 911, held her sister's head, screamed at her to stay awake. At Denver General Hospital, doctors pumped Ruth's stomach and admitted her to psychiatric care for observation. Diagnosis: major depressive episode, suicide attempt, complicated grief disorder. Ruth spent 2 weeks in the hospital's psychiatric wing. She attended group therapy with other broken people and said nothing. She met with a psychiatrist named Dr. Reeves, who spoke gently about acceptance and moving forward, and Ruth wanted to throw her coffee at him. How do you accept what can't be explained? How do you move forward when you don't know if your daughter died instantly or suffered? If she called for help? If she spent her last moments knowing she'd never see? Home again? Dr. Reeves tried a different approach. Ruth, what do you think Selina would want for you? And that question, manipulative as it was, punctured something. Selina would be furious at her mother for swallowing those pills. Selina, who loved life so ferociously, who climbed mountains. Because they were there, who wrote in her journal, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She wouldn't want Ruth to give up. But she also wouldn't want Ruth to keep torturing herself with unanswerable questions. When Ruth was discharged on October 30th, 1991, she made 2 decisions. First, she would stop writing the monthly letters. 3 years of silence had given her the only answer she'd ever receive. No one was looking anymore, and no one would look again. Second, she would try to live, genuinely live, not just exist in grief's shadow. She didn't know if she could do it, but she'd try for Selina. The box of belongings sat on Ruth's kitchen table for 3 weeks before she could touch it again. When she finally opened the journal to read beyond that last entry, she discovered something she'd missed in her initial grief-stricken state. Selina had tucked photographs throughout the pages, pictures of the trek, mountain vistas, fellow travelers, Namche Bazaar's colorful buildings, and there, near the back, a photo of Selina with Mingma Dorje and the Porter brothers, everyone smiling, taken the morning of October 16th. Selina looked radiant. Ruth stared at that photo until it blurred. Her daughter had been happy. Whatever happened that afternoon, Selina had died doing what she loved, in a place she dreamed of reaching. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Ruth carefully removed the photo and placed it in a silver frame on her mantel next to the official portrait from Selina's college graduation. Meanwhile, 7,000 miles away in Namche Bazaar, Dawa Sherpa sat at his police station desk, reviewing the Evans file for the 100th time. He'd heard about the official case closure, had even been present when his captain filed the paperwork. But Dawa couldn't stop thinking about inconsistencies that bothered him. Why had the search teams never checked the lower fissures in the Buddha's finger area, the ones accessible only after significant snowmelt? Why had no one interviewed the shepherds who used the high pastures and might have seen something? Why did Marcus Geller's statement include that strange detail about a shadow that didn't match the rocks? Dawa's captain found him with the file open. "Sherpa, let it go. Case is closed. American girl is gone. Mountains took her. That's the end." Dawa nodded, closed the file, waited for the captain to leave. Then he reopened it and continued taking notes. He couldn't explain why this case gripped him. Maybe because of his brother. Maybe because Ruth Evans's unanswered letters had eventually crossed his desk and her desperation reminded him of his mother's after they lost his brother. Maybe because Dawa believed that every disappeared person deserved someone who refused to forget them. He started spending off-duty hours talking to local shepherds and guides, asking about the Buddha's finger area, about unusual terrain features, about places where someone could fall and simply vanish. Most told him nothing useful, but one elderly Sherpa named Tenzing mentioned something interesting. There were old crevices in that region, created by glacial movement decades ago, that got covered by snow and were nearly invisible. "Someone falls in there," Tenzing said. "The mountain keeps them." Dawa marked the locations on his personal map with red X's. He needed evidence to justify reopening the case. Without it, he was just another obsessive cop chasing ghosts. He needed something concrete, something undeniable, something that would force his superiors to listen. He didn't know it yet, but that evidence was waiting beneath 14 feet of packed snow and ice, preserved by cold and darkness, about to be revealed by an accident of nature no one could have predicted. 3 years of silence, a mother's breakdown, a case declared officially dead. But in the mountains, nothing stays buried forever, and the winter of 1991 was about to deliver one of the heaviest avalanche seasons in Everest region history, exposing secrets the ice had guarded for 36 months. February 12, 1992, 15 months after the case was officially closed. The avalanche hit at 4:23 a.m., triggered by the same invisible calculus of gravity and snow physics that has killed hundreds in the Himalayas. It wasn't a major avalanche by Everest standards, no lives lost, no villages threatened. Just a modest snowslide in a remote area northeast of Namche Bazaar, the kind that happens dozens of times each winter and matters to no one except maybe the mountain goats whose paths get temporarily blocked. The shepherd who found the first object was named Lobsang Thukten, a 64-year-old man who'd spent his entire life moving yak herds through high pastures. Lobsang knew these mountains intimately, knew which trails the avalanche had altered. On February 15th, 3 days after the slide, he was guiding 12 yaks through a newly exposed section of terrain when sunlight reflected off something metallic wedged between two rocks. Lobsang was curious by nature, a lifetime in. The mountains teaches you that unusual objects sometimes have value. He climbed down from his lead yak and approached. It was a metal buckle, still attached to a scrap of blue nylon fabric. The buckle was modern, manufactured, definitely not something that belonged in this remote location. Lobsang had seen enough tourist gear over the years to recognize this was from a backpack, an expensive one by the look of it. He pulled it free from the rocks and noticed something else. The fabric had the distinctive weathering pattern of material that's been exposed to extreme cold for an extended period, not months, years. Lobsang brought the find to the Namche Bazaar police station on February 18th. He walked in holding the buckle like it might be important, which made the desk officer, a young man named Pemba, who'd been on the force 6 months, roll his eyes. Locals brought in random tourists. Garbage constantly, expecting rewards. "We don't buy found items," Pemba started to say, but then Dawa Sherpa emerged from the back office and saw what Lobsang was holding. Dawa's reaction was immediate and visceral. He crossed the station in 4 strides, took the buckle from Lobsang's hands and examined it with intensity that made Pemba step back. "Where did you find this?" Dawa's voice was controlled but urgent. Lobsang explained about the avalanche, the exposed terrain, the exact location. Dawa was already moving, pulling out topographical maps, marking coordinates, his hands shaking, slightly as he cross-referenced the location with his personal Evans file. The spot where Lobsang found the buckle was approximately 230 meters northeast of Buddha's Finger. The original search had covered the immediate Buddha's Finger area extensively, but this location was technically just outside the primary search radius. Worse, 3 years ago, this area would have been under several feet of snow during October, completely inaccessible, invisible, not even identified as a potential search zone. If Selina had somehow ended up here, the initial search teams would never have found her. Dawa requested permission from his captain to investigate the site. The captain, a weary man named Kaji, who'd been trying to get Dawa to drop the Evans obsession for years, initially refused. "The case is closed. We're not reopening it because some shepherd found old garbage." But Dawa persisted with a desperation that crossed into insubordination. "Captain, this buckle matches the inventory description of Selina Evans's backpack. Exactly. Same brand, same color, same distinctive clip design. That's not garbage. That's evidence." Kaji stared at Dawa for a long moment, then sighed. "Fine. Take Pemba. 2 days maximum. If you find nothing, you let this case go, forever, understood?" Dawa nodded, already gathering rope and climbing equipment. They reached the location at 2:15 p.m. on February 19, 1992. Lobsang served as guide, pointing out the exact crevice where he'd found the buckle. Dawa approached cautiously, examining the terrain with an experienced climber's eye. The avalanche had done something unexpected. It had cleared away decades of accumulated snow from a section of rock face, revealing a narrow fissure that descended at a steep angle. The fissure was maybe 3 feet wide, at the opening narrowing as it descended. Without the snow coverage, it would be easy to miss, just a dark crack in grey stone. With snow coverage, it would be completely invisible. Dawa secured a rope to a stable rock anchor and began descending. Pemba watched from above, thinking this was pointless, that they'd find nothing but wasted time. The fissure was tight enough that Dawa had to move sideways. His headlamp illuminated walls of rock worn smooth by ancient glacial movement. 15 feet down, the fissure widened into a small chamber, maybe 8 feet across, roughly circular, and there, protected from wind and weather by the angle of descent, partially covered by ice and rock debris, Dawa saw what he'd been searching for. The red jacket appeared first. Faded by time, but unmistakably red, the color preserved by cold and darkness. Dawa's breath caught. He descended another 6 feet, moving carefully, and the full scope of the scene became clear. Human remains partially mummified by the dry cold. A backpack, blue Kelty, matching the buckle Lobsang had found. And scattered around the small chamber, items that told a story Dawa was only beginning to understand. A water bottle, a small notebook, a thermal blanket that had been spread on the ground. Selina Evans hadn't died instantly from a fall. She'd survived it. She'd been trapped down here, injured but conscious, for some period of time. The thermal blanket suggested she'd attempted to manage her body. Temperature. The water bottle suggested she'd maintained some level of rational thinking, and the notebook. Dawa picked it up with trembling hands, careful not to damage pages that had gone brittle with age. The notebook was a small, spiral-bound pad, the kind tourists carry for quick notes. About half the pages had been used. The entries were dated. The first was October 16, 1988, approximately 6:30 p.m., 2 hours after Selina was last seen. Fell through hidden snow bridge, maybe 15-foot drop, right ankle definitely broken, left arm possibly fractured. Managed to land mostly on pack, which probably saved my life. Called for help until throat gave out. No one can hear me down here. It's getting dark. I have water, thermal blanket, 1 flashlight. Going to try to stay calm and wait for rescue. They must be searching by now. Dawa felt sick. She'd been alive, conscious, waiting for help. That never came. He continued reading. Each entry a knife wound. October 17th morning. Night was coldest thing I've ever experienced. Ankle is swelling badly. Can hear wind above but no voices. Why haven't they found me yet? October 17th, evening. Shouted all afternoon whenever I heard sounds. That might be searchers. Voice is gone now, just whispers, still no one, starting to understand how bad this is. October 18th. Water almost gone. Pain is constant. Keep drifting in and out. Dreaming about Mom's kitchen. Can smell coffee, that's probably bad sign. October 19th. If anyone finds this, tell my mom I wasn't scared at the end. Tell her I love her. Tell her the mountains were beautiful. The entries stopped there. Dawa sat in that cold chamber, holding a dead woman's final words, and wept. He'd been right that the search had missed something, but being right brought no satisfaction, only horror at imagining what Selina Evans had endured in her final days. He climbed back to the surface and radioed the station. Captain Kaji, this is Sherpa. I found her. I found Selina Evans, and we need a recovery team immediately. The recovery operation took 3 days. Professional climbers extracted Selina's remains with the respect due to someone who died alone and afraid. The items from the chamber were catalogued as evidence. The notebook, the backpack, the jacket, everything. The Nepalese government, suddenly interested now that there was media attention, brewing, issued statements about the tragic discovery and promised to review search protocols. Dawa knew it was performative bullshit. They cared now only because international press was picking up the story. The forensic examination was conducted in Kathmandu. Medical examiner Dr. Sharma's report confirmed what the notebook suggested. Selina had survived the initial fall with multiple fractures, but no immediately fatal injuries. Death came from a combination of hypothermia, dehydration, and exposure, Likely 72-96 hours after the fall. She'd been alive for 3 to 4 days. 3 to 4 days while search teams combed the area above her, never thinking to check the narrow fissures that would have been invisible under snow coverage. The failure was systematic. The initial search had focused on visible fall zones and established trails. No one had thought to probe for hidden crevices beneath snow bridges. No one had brought ground-penetrating equipment. No one had consulted with local shepherds who knew about the old glacial fissures. It wasn't malice. It was incompetence, under-resourcing, and bad luck compounded into tragedy. Dawa read Dr. Sharma's report in the police station and felt rage build in his chest. This was preventable. If the search had been more thorough, if they'd had proper equipment, if someone had listened to his questions 3 years ago, Selena Evans might have been saved. Not definitely, but possibly. And possible was everything the international media descended on Namche Bazaar within a week. CNN ran a segment titled, "The Woman Who Died Waiting for Rescue." The New York Times published a front-page story, "Hiker's Body Found After 3 Years. Diary Reveals She Survived Days." The Denver Post dedicated 4 pages to Selena's story, including excerpts from the journal and interviews with Ruth Evans. The narrative was irresistible to journalists, a young woman experienced and prepared who died not from recklessness, but from a freak accident and systemic failure. Ruth Evans learned about the discovery on February 23, 1992. She was at work. She'd returned to part-time library duty 6 months earlier as part of her therapy, when Ellen called. "Ruth, you need to come home right now. There's news about Selena." Ruth knew from her sister's tone that the news wasn't good, but also that it was real, definitive, the kind of information that ends uncertainty even as it destroys hope. Ellen had been contacted by the State Department. They'd found Selena's body. They'd found her journal. Ruth would be receiving official notification within hours, but Ellen thought her sister should hear it from family first. Ruth listened to the details, the avalanche, the shepherd, the fissure, the notebook, and felt something twist inside her chest. Relief and devastation, gratitude and rage, all mixed together into an emotional cocktail she had no name for. She was alive, Ruth said quietly. After she fell, she was alive. "Yes," Ellen confirmed, crying now, for several days. Ruth hung up and stood in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd received the first call about Selena's disappearance, the same kitchen where she'd opened the box of belongings, the same kitchen where she'd almost ended her own life. And she made a decision. This wasn't over. Finding Selena's body didn't close the case. It opened a new chapter. Someone needed to be held accountable for the failures that killed her daughter. Someone needed to ensure this never happened to another family. The State Department arranged for Selena's remains to be transported to the United States. Ruth flew to Washington, D.C. to meet with officials, bringing the box of Selena's belongings she'd received in 1991 and demanding answers. Why hadn't the search been more thorough? Why weren't families given accurate information about search limitations? Why did it take an accidental avalanche to find her daughter, when proper protocols might have succeeded in 1988? The officials were sympathetic but defensive. They explained limited resources, difficult terrain, unprecedented circumstances. Ruth listened with growing fury. "My daughter didn't die from falling," she said, voice shaking. "She died from being abandoned. She died because no one looked hard enough. How many lives hang in the balance of systematic failures? How many families deserve answers they'll never receive?" Ruth Evans was about to transform her private grief into public advocacy, and the truth about what happened to Selena was about to spark reforms that would change mountain rescue protocols forever. The journal became the most important piece of evidence, but also the most emotionally devastating document Ruth Evans would ever read. The State Department offered to provide summarized content to spare her from the full details. Ruth refused. "She's my daughter. I will read every word she wrote." On March 8, 1992, Ruth sat in her Boulder living room with Ellen beside her and opened the restored journal. The conservation team at the State Department had done remarkable work. Pages that had been frozen, brittle, partially damaged by moisture, were now readable, protected in archival sleeves. Ruth began with the entries from Kathmandu, reading about Selina's excitement, her observations about the city, her anticipation for the trek. Then came the final entries from the fissure. Reading them was like being with Selina during her final hours. Ruth could hear her daughter's voice in the words, the initial optimism. They must be searching by now. The growing concern. Why haven't they found me yet? The pain breaking through. Ankle is swelling badly. And finally the acceptance. Tell my mum I wasn't scared at the end. That last entry shattered Ruth because Selina was scared. Of course she was scared. She just didn't want her mother to carry that burden. But the journal contained more than just the dated entries. On the final pages, Selina had written something different, a detailed account of exactly what happened. As her situation grew more desperate, she documented everything, perhaps understanding that this notebook might be the only testimony she could leave. October 16th, 5:45 p.m. I was walking along the trail to Buddha's Finger, maybe 20 meters ahead of Marcus. I stepped on what looked like solid snow. It collapsed immediately, snow bridge over a hidden crevice, something I should have anticipated but didn't. The fall wasn't long, maybe 15 feet, but I hit hard, landed partially on my pack, which probably saved my spine. Right. Ankle gave a crack I could hear. Pain was instant and overwhelming. I called for Marcus, shouted until my throat was raw. The acoustics in this fissure are strange. My voice seems to get absorbed by the rock instead of carrying upward. After maybe 30 minutes, I heard voices above. Distant, but definitely voices. I screamed for help, kept screaming, but they moved away. I don't think they could hear me. That first night was the worst cold I've ever experienced. I used my thermal blanket and tried to insulate myself with the pack, but the cold seeps up from the rock. I have water and some trail mix. My ankle is grotesquely swollen. I can't put weight on it. The walls here are too smooth and steep to climb, and I only have about 8 feet of cord in my pack, nowhere near enough to attempt anything. October 17th, I can hear search activity above. Voices, movement, maybe equipment sounds. I shout every time, but they never seem to hear. The fissure must muffle sound in strange ways. I'm trying to stay rational, trying to manage pain, trying to believe they'll find me. October 18th. Water almost gone. Pain is constant companion now. I keep thinking about Mom's last hug at the airport, how she held on extra long and I was slightly embarrassed. I'd give anything for that hug now. October 19th. I'm writing this because I need someone to know what happened. I wasn't reckless. I was careful. But the mountains don't care about careful. This was just bad luck. Wrong step, wrong place, wrong moment. I don't want Mom to blame herself. I don't want anyone to say I was stupid or unprepared. Sometimes mountains just take people, and there's no reason, no lesson, no meaning to find. If rescuers are reading this, the fissure is hidden by snow. You probably walked right over it multiple times. It's not your fault either. Just bad luck all around. To my family, I love you. I'm sorry I worried you. The mountains were beautiful. I was happy here. That matters. Ruth read this section 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Her daughter's final act was to absolve everyone, her family, the rescuers, even the mountain itself. But Ruth wasn't interested in absolution. She was interested in accountability. The investigation that followed was extensive but frustrating. The Nepalese government commissioned an official inquiry into the 1988 search operation. The report, released in June 1992, found procedural deficiencies, but stopped short of assigning direct blame. The search teams had followed standard protocols for the resources available. The problem was that standard protocols were inadequate for the terrain and conditions. Key findings included: search teams lacked ground-penetrating equipment to detect hidden crevices. No protocol existed for systematically probing snow-covered areas for hidden voids. Local knowledge from shepherds and experienced Sherpas wasn't incorporated into search planning. Communication between Nepalese authorities and U.S. Embassy was fragmented and inconsistent. Search area boundaries were determined by visibility and accessibility rather than comprehensive terrain analysis. The report concluded that Selina's death was a tragic accident exacerbated by systemic limitations in mountain rescue capabilities. Ruth found this conclusion both validating and enraging. Yes, systemic limitations, yes, inadequate protocols, but those were just bureaucratic terms for failures that killed her daughter. Marcus Geller provided a statement to investigators that added crucial detail. He'd been consumed by guilt for 3.5 years, believing he should have stayed closer to Selina, should have insisted on descending together, should have done something differently. The discovery of the journal actually brought him unexpected relief. Selina herself had written that he couldn't have known about the snow bridge, couldn't have prevented the fall. But Marcus also revealed something he'd mentioned in his original 1988 statement that investigators had dismissed. He'd heard what he thought was a faint sound shortly after Selina disappeared, something that might have been a distant voice. He'd called out, but received no response, so he'd assumed it was wind or echo. Now he realized it might have been Selina, shouting from the fissure while he was meters away. Mingma Dorje Sherpa's testimony was the most devastating. The guide had carried guilt heavier than any physical burden over the years. He'd granted Selina's request to explore the secondary trail. He'd estimated the risk as minimal. He'd been wrong. When shown Selina's journal entry absolving rescuers and acknowledging the hidden nature of the fissure, Mingma broke down completely. Through a translator, he said, "She forgives us, but I cannot forgive myself. I should have said no. I should have been more careful. She trusted me to keep her safe." Ruth met with Mingma during her second trip to Nepal in August 1992. The meeting was arranged through Dawa Sherpa, who'd become Ruth's primary contact in the country. Mingma arrived at the Kathmandu hotel looking 10 years older than his actual age of 42. He could barely make eye contact with Ruth, but Ruth had no interest in punishing him. She'd read Selina's words. She understood that blame was a comfortable fiction people created to make sense of senseless events. "My daughter wrote that this wasn't your fault," Ruth said through the translator. "She was clear about that, I believe her, but I need you to help me understand exactly what happened so we can prevent it from happening again." Mingma provided a detailed reconstruction of that day, the timeline, the decisions, the search, efforts, everything. He also explained something Ruth hadn't fully understood. The avalanche danger in October made it impossible to safely explore some areas. The searchers had been forced to avoid certain zones that might have revealed the fissure. Weather and terrain had conspired with bad luck to create the perfect conditions for tragedy. The forensic reconstruction was completed in September 1992. Investigators determined that Selina had stepped onto a snow bridge that had formed over a narrow glacial fissure, a natural formation created by centuries of ice movement. The bridge was approximately 4 inches thick, sufficient to appear solid but inadequate to support a person's weight. Once she fell through, the fissure's narrow opening and steep angle made escape impossible without specialized equipment. The acoustics of the chamber, combined with wind and the fissure's depth, meant her shouts were likely inaudible to searchers above. Death had come on October 19th or 20th, likely from a combination of hypothermia and dehydration. The cold had preserved her body remarkably well, which allowed for detailed forensic analysis. Dr. Sharma's expanded report noted that if Selina had been found within the first 48 hours, survival would have been possible. The injuries, while serious, weren't immediately fatal. After 48 hours, progressive hypothermia made survival increasingly unlikely, even with rescue. This timeline tormented Ruth. 48 hours, 2 days. If the search had been more thorough, more systematic, better equipped, Selina might have survived, might have. That word carried weight that crushed Ruth's chest every time she thought it. But alongside the grief came something else. Determination. Ruth Evans decided that Selina's death had to mean something. It couldn't just be another statistic in the long list of mountain tragedies. She began advocating for comprehensive reform of mountain rescue protocols, focusing on the Everest region, but with implications for alpine rescue worldwide. She partnered with international mountaineering organizations, including the Alpine Club and the International Mountaineering and Climbing Federation. She testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation, advocating for better coordination between U.S. authorities and foreign rescue services. She established the Selina Evans Mountain Safety Foundation, funding research into improved rescue technologies and training programs. The reforms came slowly, but they came. By 1994, Nepalese authorities had implemented new protocols requiring ground-penetrating radar equipment for all major search operations. Training programs for rescue teams now included modules on hidden terrain features and systematic search patterns. Communication protocols between embassies and local authorities were standardized. Emergency rescue funds were established to ensure resource limitations didn't compromise search efforts. Dawa Sherpa was instrumental in implementing these changes. His persistence in pursuing Selina's case, despite official discouragement, made him a symbol of the reform movement. He was promoted to lead the newly created Mountain Rescue Coordination Unit in Namche Bazaar, a position that allowed him to ensure the systemic failures that killed Selina wouldn't be repeated. Ruth and Dawa developed an unlikely friendship across language barriers and cultural divides. Two people bound by their refusal to let Selina be forgotten. "Your daughter saved lives," Dawa told Ruth during her third Nepal visit in 1995. His English improved through 3 years of correspondence. "The protocols we have now, they exist because of her, because you wouldn't let her story die. But reforms and protocols couldn't answer the question that haunted Ruth every sleepless night. What were Selina's final thoughts? Did she know how loved she was? And how does a mother find peace when the only closure she receives is a notebook filled with her daughter's dying words?" May 16, 1994. 6 years after Selina disappeared, Ruth Evans stood at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu, waiting for the final transfer of her daughter's remains. The Nepalese government had kept Selina's body for forensic study and legal proceedings, but now, finally, she was coming home. Ruth was 57 years old, her hair fully grey, her face carved with lines that grief had etched deep. But she stood straight, shoulders back, because this was the moment she'd fought for through 3 years of investigation, political advocacy, and sheer stubborn refusal to let bureaucracy have the final word. Dawa Sherpa accompanied her. He'd taken personal leave to ensure everything proceeded smoothly. Over the years, Dawa had become more than a contact. He was family in the way that shared trauma creates family. He understood Ruth's loss because he'd lived in its shadow, dedicating his career to ensuring no other family experienced what the Evans family had endured. The casket was simple, made of pine, marked with official seals and documentation. Ruth placed her hand on the wood and whispered, "I'm taking you home, baby girl, finally taking you home." Dawa stood respectfully back, giving her privacy, but when Ruth turned to him with tears streaming, he stepped forward and embraced her. No words, just human connection across the abyss of loss. The funeral was held on May 22, 1994, at Green Mountain Cemetery in Boulder. The memorial stone Thomas had insisted on in 1989 was finally accurate. Selina Marie Evans, 1964-1988. Beloved daughter, forever in the mountains. The service was attended by more than 300 people, family, friends, former students from Selina's climbing instruction days, mountaineering community members, and dozens of strangers who'd followed the story and felt compelled to pay respects. Ruth had requested that selected portions of Selina's final journal be read aloud. Her nephew, Michael, who'd been close to Selina growing up, stood at the podium and read the passage where Selina wrote about not wanting her mother to blame herself, about the mountains being beautiful, about being happy there. His voice broke multiple times. There wasn't a dry eye in the gathering, but the eulogy Ruth delivered wasn't focused on grief, it was focused on legacy. "My daughter died alone in the dark, in pain, waiting for rescue that came 3 years too late," Ruth began, her voice steady despite shaking hands. "I can't change that. I can't bring her back. But I can make sure that her death wasn't meaningless. Selena's story has already changed mountain rescue protocols. It's improved training, it's saved lives, and that work continues. She announced the official launch of the Selena Evans Mountain Safety Foundation with an initial endowment of $200,000, money raised through donor campaigns, speaking fees from Ruth's advocacy work, and a settlement from the trekking company that had been found negligent in certain procedural aspects. The foundation's mission was threefold: fund research into rescue technologies, provide training grants for mountain rescue teams in developing countries, and offer support services for families of mountain accident victims. The Foundation's first major initiative was partnering with MIT's engineering department to develop portable ground-penetrating radar equipment light enough for rescue teams to carry in alpine conditions. By 1996, the prototype was field-tested in the Everest region. By 1998, it was standard equipment for major search operations in Nepal, Peru, and the Alps. The technology had directly contributed to successful rescues of 7 climbers who'd fallen into hidden crevices, 7 people who might have died, like Selena, without the improved detection capability. Each rescue was a vindication of Ruth's 3-year crusade, proof that systemic change could translate into saved lives. Dawa Sherpa received the Foundation's first Guardian Award in 1995, recognizing his role in solving Selena's case and implementing reforms. He traveled to Boulder for the ceremony, his first time visiting the United States. Ruth took him to all of Selena's favorite childhood places, the trails they'd hiked, the climbing gym where she'd worked, the coffee shop where she'd spent hours studying maps and planning. Adventures. "I wanted you to know her," Ruth explained, "not just as a case, but as a person." Dawa was deeply moved. He'd spent so many years studying a file that meeting Selena through her physical spaces made her real in a way that paperwork never could. He stood in Summit Dreams gym where Selena had taught beginners how to belay, imagining her voice echoing off those walls, her hands demonstrating knots with patient precision. The reforms Ruth advocated for extended beyond Nepal. She testified before committees in Switzerland, Peru, New Zealand, and Canada, anywhere with significant mountaineering tourism. Her message was consistent. Tourist safety cannot be compromised by inadequate resources or poor coordination. Families deserve transparent communication. Search protocols must keep pace with technology. And most crucially, economic concerns cannot override human life. Not everyone welcomed the reforms. Some in the mountaineering industry complained that increased safety requirements raised costs and reduced accessibility. Ruth's response was blunt. If you can't ensure basic safety protocols, you shouldn't be taking people into the mountains, period. The journal, eventually published with Ruth's permission in 1997 as part of a comprehensive book about mountain safety titled The Hidden Dangers, Learning from Everest Tragedies. Ruth wrote the introduction, explaining that making Selena's final words public was painful but necessary. She documented what happened so that others might learn from it, Ruth wrote. Honor her by learning. Honor her by being better prepared. Honor her by demanding better safety standards. The book became required reading in many alpine rescue training programs. Selena's clear, methodical description of her situation, even in extremis, provided valuable insights into what trapped climbers experience and what information they try to convey. Marcus Geller reached out to Ruth in 1998, 10 years after Selena's disappearance. He'd been consumed by guilt for a decade, had quit climbing entirely, had struggled with depression and PTSD. But reading Selena's published journal, specifically the part where she absolved him of any responsibility, had given him permission to begin healing. They met in Denver, at a quiet restaurant neither had been to before. Marcus apologized for things Ruth told him needed no apology. She showed him photos of Selena as a child, shared stories he'd never heard. She loved adventure, Ruth said. What happened wasn't because of bad decisions, it was because of bad luck and inadequate systems. You didn't fail her, the systems failed her. Marcus became a vocal advocate for the Foundation, using his experience to train other climbers about hidden dangers and the psychological impacts of mountain accidents. By 2000, the foundation had expanded internationally, with chapters in 7 countries. It had funded 23 research projects, trained over 1,200 rescue personnel, and provided support services to 89 families dealing with mountain accidents. The impact was measurable. Rescue success rates in the Everest region had improved by 34% since the new protocols were implemented. Response times had decreased. Survival rates for non-fatal accidents had increased. Lives were being saved because one mother refused to accept that her daughter's death was meaningless. Ruth retired from active foundation management in 2003 at age 66, passing leadership to a professional board while remaining on as founder emeritus. She'd spent 15 years transforming her private grief into public good, and the work had given her life meaning when meaning seemed impossible to find. But she was tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying loss as a daily companion for 15 years. On October 16, 2003, the 15th anniversary of Selena's disappearance, Ruth returned to Nepal one final time. Dawa met her in Kathmandu, and together they trekked to the location where Selena had fallen. The fissure had been marked with a memorial plaque in 1995, installed by the foundation with the Nepalese government's cooperation. Selena Marie Evans, 1964-1988. Her tragedy led to reforms that have saved many lives. May all who travel these mountains return safely home. Ruth stood at that plaque for a long time, hand resting on the cold metal. She thought about the 3 days Selena had spent trapped there, alone and afraid. She thought about the journal entries written in growing desperation. She thought about the what-ifs that had tormented her for 15 years, but she also thought about the 7 climbers rescued because of improved radar technology. The families spared her particular hell because communication protocols now functioned properly. "I did what I could," Ruth said aloud, speaking to the mountain, to her daughter's memory, to the universe's indifferent vastness. "I made it matter. I made you matter." Dawa stood beside her, his own hair now streaked with grey. "She mattered," he confirmed. "She still matters. Every life saved carries her legacy." They descended together as the sun set, painting the Himalayan peaks in shades of gold and rose, the same light that had bathed Selena's face in Marcus's final photograph 15 years earlier. Beautiful and indifferent, deadly and magnificent. Ruth Evans died peacefully in her sleep on March 8, 2009, at age 72. The foundation she'd built continued its work, expanding into climate change impacts on mountain safety and mental health support for rescue personnel. Dawa Sherpa attended her funeral in Boulder, standing before the gathered crowd to deliver a eulogy that honored both Ruth and Selena. "In my culture," Dawa said, "we believe that mountains are sacred, and those who die in the mountains become part of them forever. Selena Evans is part of Everest now. But Ruth Evans made sure that Selena's part of Everest includes protecting others. That is how love defeats death, not by reversing it, but by making it meaningful." The case of Selena Evans had become one of the most influential mountain accident cases in history, not because of the tragedy itself, but because of what came after. Justice wasn't about punishment, it was about prevention. Closure wasn't about forgetting, it was about transforming grief into purpose. Legacy wasn't about being remembered, it was about the lives touched, changed, and saved by one young woman's final words and one grieving mother's unstoppable determination to make those words matter. Selena Evans died on a mountain on October 1988. But through Ruth's work, through Dawa's dedication, through the foundation's impact, she never stopped saving lives.